All right, let's talk about a moment in history that really shouldn't have happened. We're going to dive into how a Crusader army, starving, sick, and totally outnumbered, managed to capture a fortress that was, for all intents and purposes, unbeatable. This is the story of the 9-month Siege of Antioch. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why this siege was considered impossible from the get-go. Then, we'll dig into the 4 key reasons they pulled it off. And finally, we'll see how it all culminated in the city's incredible fall. Ready? Let's get into it.
So picture this. It's October 1097. The First Crusade rolls up to the walls of Antioch. And what they see, well, it's not just a city. It's a fortress that was basically designed to be unconquerable. A military nightmare.
I mean, just look at these stats. The walls were miles long, ridiculously thick and high, with towers everywhere. The city was so huge, the Crusaders couldn't even surround it. That meant the defenders could just keep getting supplies in through a few gates. Plus, they had farmland inside the walls and this massive citadel perched on a mountain. Antioch wasn't built to just survive a siege. It was built to break the army doing the sieging. And sure enough, as winter hit, things got ugly. Really ugly. We have this quote from Fulcher of Chartres, who was actually there, and it's grim. People were starving, eating anything they could find. Disease was everywhere. We're talking maybe 1 out of every 5 Crusaders died. Which brings us to the big question, right? How in the world did they pull this off? Well, there's no single easy answer. It was really a mix of 4 key things all coming together at just the right time. And we're going to unpack each one of them. Okay, first up, leadership. Now, the Crusader commanders argued a lot. But when it came to actual battlefield tactics, one man was an absolute game changer, Bohemond of Taranto. Okay, check this out, because this is brilliant. Bohemond's got just 700 horsemen, and he's up against an army 12 times that size. He knows the Turks love to use their fast horse archers to surround and destroy you. So what does he do? He picks his ground perfectly, using a river and a lake so they can't get around his flanks. He sets his guys up in divisions, but, and this is the key, he holds one back in reserve. He lets the enemy attack, waits for them to get bogged down, and then he unleashes that reserve. Boom, smashes their lines. It was an incredible win and showed he'd learned a tough lesson from a previous battle. So yeah, Bohemond's tactical mind was a massive plus. But here's the flip side. The leadership was a mess. They were always bickering, and Bohemond himself was totally driven by his own ambition. He wanted Antioch for himself. This wasn't just friendly squabbling. It nearly broke the whole crusade apart. But okay, let's switch gears and see what was happening on the other side of the walls. You know, the Crusaders got lucky with their timing. They showed up in Syria right in the middle of a political meltdown. The big Seljuk Empire had fractured, and the whole region was just a bunch of rival cities all fighting each other. And that played right into the Crusaders' hands. You had these 2 brothers, Ridwan of Aleppo and Dukak of Damascus. They were the 2 biggest players around, and they hated each other's guts. Seriously, they saw each other as a bigger threat than this invading army from Europe. So instead of teaming up, they sent their own separate armies to relieve Antioch. This was a gift to Bohemond, who could just pick them off one by one. And this next bit is the perfect example of their disunity. A guy named Kerboga finally gets a huge army together to crush the Crusaders. But on his way to Antioch, he gets sidetracked. He decides to spend 3 weeks trying to capture the city of Edessa, just to protect his own power base. 3 weeks. That delay was everything. It gave Bohemond the exact sliver of time he needed to pull off his master plan. So you see the pattern, right? The individual Muslim armies were tough, no question. But their failure to work together was a fatal weakness. Even an Arab historian at the time, Ibn al-Athir, basically said that this disunity is what let the Franks, as he called them, overrun the place. It was a self-inflicted wound. But look, clever tactics and a divided enemy don't matter if your army just starves to death outside the walls. And the Crusaders came so close to that, multiple times. They only survived because of 2 things, a little help from their friends and a whole lot of faith. So for months, the Crusaders had this problem. They couldn't actually surround the city. The solution? They built these things called Gegenbergen, which is German for counter-castles. Think of them as offensive forts, built right outside the city gates to choke off supplies. But building a castle while you're also fighting a war, that's a massive job. They were never going to do it on their own. And that's where their allies came in. This help was literally the lifeblood of the siege. You had fleets from Genoa and England showing up with engineers, tools, and supplies from the Byzantine Empire. With that help, they built a bridge of boats to protect their supply line from the port. And, most importantly, they could finally build those counter-castles to seal off the city. This is what turned a failing siege into a real, strangling blockade. But, and this is a big but, you couldn't count on either of these things completely. Allied help was flaky. The main Byzantine commander just packed up and left. And the Byzantine emperor himself turned his own relief army around. And as for religious zeal, yeah, it kept a lot of guys going, but it couldn't stop everyone. Even famous figures like Peter the Hermit tried to desert. So yeah, these things were vital for just surviving. But survival isn't victory. Faith and supplies weren't going to knock down those walls. So here's where we are. The blockade is finally working. The city is starting to starve. But the clock is ticking, and it's ticking fast. Kurbaga and his massive army are just over the horizon. The Crusaders had to get inside the city, and they had to do it now. Charging the walls was suicide. Waiting for them to surrender would take way too long. There was only one option left. They had to get sneaky. The answer wasn't going to be about breaking down the walls from the outside. It was about opening them from the inside. And that brings us to a man named Firoz. He was an Armenian captain of one of the towers. And for weeks, Bohemond had been playing the long game, secretly communicating with him, planting the seeds of betrayal. And this is where Bohemond's cunning really shines. First, he uses the fear of Kerboka's army as leverage. He basically tells the other Crusader leaders, "Promise me I get to rule this city if we take it, or I won't tell you my secret plan." They agree. Then, he puts the plan into action. He marches the army away as a fake-out, making the defenders relax. Then, under the cover of darkness, a small team sneaks back. Firuz drops the ladder, and they're in. It was pure political and military genius. And we actually have this quote from a chronicle written at the time, the Gesta Francarum, that shows you the desperate deal they struck. They basically said, "Okay, Bohemond, you can have this city unless the Byzantine emperor helps us. Then we have to give it back to him." It was a promise they had no intention of keeping, and that decision would cause huge problems down the line. So when you ask how Antioch was won, there's no single answer. It was a perfect storm. You had Bohemians' leadership creating the opportunity. You had Muslim disunity giving them the time they desperately needed. You had Allied aid providing the tools to apply pressure. And you had that religious fire that gave the soldiers the will to hang on just long enough to see it through. Seriously, take away any one of those pieces and the whole thing falls apart. The city stands. Which leaves us with a big question you have to ask about this whole campaign. Was the fall of Antioch a story of Christian brilliance, or was it a story of Muslim failure? And really, the evidence points to both. It was a case of strategic genius colliding with political opportunity. The Crusaders, and Bohemond in particular, had just enough skill, just enough cunning, and just enough endurance to exploit the fatal cracks in their enemy's foundation, right at the perfect moment. Thanks for joining us.